Here we go. Good evening and welcome. My name is Chris Alexander. I'm the associate pastor here at Countryside Community Church, and I'm here to welcome you. So thank you for being here as a part of our Center for Faith Studies lecture series that we do. It's an amazing ministry, and it helps us reach out across our community to people that we might not be able to talk to in any other way. So I'm really happy to see all these happy faces here tonight. I had the pleasure last night of working with another one of our ministries called Darkwood Brew, where we are an internet television show, and we bring in guests to speak to us about theological concepts and ideas and scripture texts and things. And Deborah Grassman was our guest last night, and I didn't know anything about her. I had never met her until yesterday, and I was floored. It was an amazing show, and I learned so much. Her whole work with what she calls soul injury is an amazing ministry in and of itself. She says she's not a theologian, but in fact, she's a beautiful theologian. She touches people and connects with them in a way that most ministers and churches I know have no idea how to go about doing. So I'm really pleased to have met her and to know the ministry she works with. I myself do some counseling with vets, and the work that they are going through to just clear out some of the things that stands in their way of moving forward into life most graciously is a very daunting experience. And so to know that somebody's out there leading the way and helping these folks get there, it's hopeful for all of us, even when we're not at the end of our life, because every day is a struggle for most of us. And so to have some of these ideas and these thoughts behind how we go about living our lives is incredibly helpful. And so I'm very pleased to know Deborah Grassman and to know that she's out there doing wonderful work, and I'm pleased that she's here to tell you about that work because it's very touching and very moving. I also get the fun job of asking you that if you have one of these things in your pockets, that you will please turn them off so as to not to interrupt the conversation and the flow. And I'd like to introduce to you now our director of Center for Faith Studies, who is Keller, who's been with us almost a year now, and she's equally as fabulous in her ministry here too. So we're really glad to have her. So thank you, Kelly.
Well, thank you for your generosity and your compliments. And thank you all for being here this evening. One thing I want to mention before introducing Deborah tonight is that Center for Faith Studies would not exist without the generosity of Countryside Community Church and its members, as well as we do receive some underwriting from the Sherwood Foundation. And this evening's event, we also received generous underwriting from the Sarah Care Hospice Foundation. And we also have with us Evan Downey from the At Ease Foundation, if you would stand. The At Ease Foundation was a partner in tonight's event, and they have some information at the table, and he'll be there after tonight's event as well. So we're very pleased to be able to highlight ministries such as At Ease work, as well as we do have some material there for the Wounded Warriors Family Support Network, which is based in Omaha, but is a national ministry for veterans and their families. So I want to recognize those partners this evening. Our theme this year for the Center for Faith Studies has been Dwell With Me. Sitting with this idea that God asks God's people to make the earth hospitable for God's Spirit by living peacefully with each other and with the created world. And living peacefully with each other includes sitting and listening to each other's stories and experiences and letting those dwell deep with us long after we hear the story. I can't think of more compelling stories than the ones we're going to be shared with us this evening by Deborah Grassman. She has been a pioneer in the care of dying veterans. As she said this morning on her interview with KIOS, she, in her work with the Veterans Administration in Florida, really started the process of understanding PTSD and its relationship at end of life, which is truly a different take and something and a dot that needed connected for many professionals. And so she single-handedly transformed and is transforming the way hospices around the country are approaching veterans at end of life. And I thank you for that in my own experience of working with those veterans. Deborah is most well known for Wounded Warriors, Their Last Battle presentation, which was, again, the first of its kind to identify these unique needs of dying veterans. But she is also now on an exciting new journey, building a movement, as she calls it, working with the foundation that she co-founded, Opus Peace, that extrapolates these lessons that we can learn from these very brave soldiers and their families on understanding the nature of sacrifice, forgiveness, healing, and ultimately hope that we can bring into all sorts of situations of trauma that we find in our world. You don't have to go to a combat zone to find trauma in people's lives. And so she's now embarking on the important work of letting these veterans really lead the way on peace for all of us. So without further ado, please help me welcome Deborah Grassman.
It's on. Okay, it's on. Well, thank you so much, Kelly, for your generosity in that. And thank you, each of you, for coming tonight. Thank you for wanting to hear about our Vietnam veterans and some of their unique needs among veterans. So I'm just going to start off with a slideshow, and that'll kind of set the tone before I get started. Make sure you can all kind of be close enough. If you can't really read the screens, make sure that you move up closer. And maybe, Nick, if you turn the lights down just a little bit for the slideshow, if possible.
There are those who say the world is in a bad way. Too much grief, too many troubles to cut through. But I see a light there in the darkness, and it seems to be coming from you. And the world will see a better tomorrow. That's what every person deserves. Just a pipe dream, that it's always been a planet filled with strife. But I look around and I see people who refuse to give up on love and life. And the world will see a better tomorrow. What every person deserves, because you care.
So I want to start out this evening by just acknowledging those here who have served. And so I just want to ask any of you that have served in the military to please stand so that we might be able to give you the honor that is your due. Thank you. Well, I'm going to talk about Vietnam specifically tonight. In general, over my 30-year career at the VA, I have personally taken care of 10,000 dying veterans. More than that who did not die, but 10,000 dying veterans. And so I stand here before you really to share what they have taught me. Because when you're in the last few weeks, the last few months of life, everything shifts and people learn. One of the things I say about dying people is that dying people are fertile ground for healing. Fertile ground. So their stories often come out. They bring a different perspective. You know, right now, if I told you you only had a week or a month or a year to live, everything would shift, and it shifts very rapidly, and you would leave here, and your life would be very different, and there'd be a lot of healing going on in your life in the days ahead. So that's the benefit. That's the gift that I have gotten in doing hospice work, and certainly doing hospice work with veterans has been one of the greatest gifts of my life. Because these people who have been through war and or trained for war are often, you peel back those layers, and after war they become peace seekers. They can teach us about peace. So in speaking about Vietnam in particular, a war of my generation, a couple of things. The first thing that I realized about Vietnam and what these veterans have taught me is that Vietnam was different. It was a different war. And we're going to talk a bit tonight about how it was different. I want to start with some statistics. First of all, you see up there the trajectory of our World War II vets and their deaths. And if you look at 2015, you can see we are on the decline for that. Now let's look at Vietnam vets and Korean vets. And look what's happening in 2015. The number of World War II Korean and Vietnam vets who are dying right now in America is all about the same numbers. And then look what happens after 2015. So those of you, how many do hospice care in here? Yeah, several, okay, many of you. You're going to be seeing a lot more Vietnam vets. So the things that we're going to be talking about today, I want you to pay particular attention to, because they have some unique needs, and there's reasons why. So a couple of things, too, when we think about war and every war being different. In World War II, the average number of battles per year was about 40. How many battles per year do you think there was with the Vietnam War? It's about 240. See what I'm talking about when I'm saying, you know, wars are different? Here's some other statistics you may or may not be interested in with Vietnam. But sometimes we just, you know, sort of forget about these things and what they live with afterward. Another thing I want you to think about with the Vietnam War is this. More Vietnam veterans died after the war was over than died in the war. They died of suicide after the war was over. So I want to say that again. More Vietnam veterans died of suicide after the war was over than died in the war. Why is that important? Because it tells us how difficult the aftermath of war can be. It is difficult. People don't just sweep it under the carpet and keep going after the war is over. The other thing I want everybody to be reminded of, everybody knows about the VA, but a lot of times people don't realize that there are vet centers available. Anybody here from the vet center? You know, the vet centers were formed by the Vietnam vets. They are for Vietnam vets, and they're often, now they're more associated with the VA, but used to they weren't even associated with the VA because the vets didn't trust the government, right? The government had already betrayed them. But I just want you to be aware that vet centers are in your community. They're kind of inconspicuous sometimes. Look them up on Google so that you know where they are, because they are a great resource for our veterans. Now, I want to form a parallel that may be a little easier to identify with when I'm talking about the different cultures of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And I want to use a different example. And this is the example. I want you to pretend like we had a child here, say a young girl, who had been molested by her father. And she goes to her mother and tells her what happened. Her mother could have one of three responses. Her mother could say, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened. That will never happen again. I will protect you, I will get help for you, and we will get through this together." The mother could have that response, couldn't she? Or the mother could have a different response. The mother could say, "Oh, let's just don't talk about that. No, let's just sweep it under the carpet." Or even more, the mother could say, "What do you mean he molested you? What did you do? You must have done something to entice him." Here's my question to you. Would that child's recovery be different based on the mother's response? We could see that easily. Can we not see that easily? Of course it would be different based on the mother's response. Well, let's think about this. We go back to World War II. If you would have said anything bad about a World War II veteran, what would have happened to you? Yeah, I remember saying something when I was little about my uncle who served in World War II, and my dad, his brother's going, "Well, he was in the war." And I didn't know what that meant. I'm like this, and I'm going, "Oh, okay," but I knew pretty quickly, okay, I don't ever say anything about how strange he's acting, right? Let's come to Korea. Do we even call it a war? We don't call it a war, Korean War. What do we call it? Yeah, a police action. Sometimes it's called the Forgotten War. And that's pretty much how we treat our Korean War veterans. We just kind of minimize or ignore what they went through. That was nothing. Wasn't even a war. And then we come over here to Vietnam. How did we meet and greet and treat our Vietnam vets when they got home? Right in the airports, oftentimes. They were called murderers, baby killers. They were often spit upon. So I often have to ask myself, where did their stories of trauma go? Because the truth is, we did not want to hear them. And so those stories often got locked up into unconsciousness, and guess when they reemerge sometimes? Now, decades later, maybe when they retire, or often when they come into hospice. So the wars and the culture of war was different, and we need to understand that as healthcare providers. So, I don't know how many of you know Paul Schutte. He and I did a film together for Hospice Foundation of America last year that a lot of hospices used. And he's a professor at George Washington University in D.C. And he told a story on the film about his experience in Vietnam. But he didn't tell the story that I thought was the most important. And here's what he had told me privately. He said that he had, gone into the service, and, in basic training, they give you a gun and they do target practice, right? And he said he loved it. And he said he was really good at it. And he said, he's doing all this target practice every day. He said, it was great when the target was a round circle, but when they changed the circle to an outline of a body, silhouette, he couldn't do it. And so, of course, he goes to his drill instructor and says, "I can't do it." Well, what do you think his drill instructor said? And he went, "Yeah, that's right." He wasn't too pleased with that answer, right? He still wouldn't do it, so he got a lot of KP duty. Well, he was really in this dilemma, didn't know what to do about it. He's doing his KP duty, and he's peeling potatoes. He's got this big pot of boiling water, and he said he looked at this pot of boiling water, and he plunged his hands in the pot of boiling water so that they would be, disfigured enough that he could not hold a gun. Well, at any rate, of course, he's taken to the hospital, and his hands actually did recover enough, but they did understand that he was not going to be able to be in the infantry. So they retrained him to be a corpsman, a medic, rather. So at any rate, he did 2 tours in Vietnam. And I want to just read to you. I had him write his story out for our website. And I just want to read to you one paragraph that he wrote, because I think it has great implications for us. How many in here are healthcare providers of some kind? You are serving healthcare in some way. Okay. He has some very important things for us to know about. Here's what he wrote. Once home from Vietnam, no one asked us about our experiences. And even if they did, we lied, or we told stories about our buddies, or some of the pranks, or what the food was like. We did not tell them the truth. Why would we? Why would I want to burden my loved ones with my experiences of horror, of listening to the screams of the dying, of watching the dogs steal amputated limbs, of the chopper that landed with a huge canvas bag suspended under its belly while we were ordered to assemble 11 complete soldiers? Even now, I'm finding it hard to reveal this truth to you. But these are the kinds of truths that each of my brothers and sisters who served in that war bring with us as we age and seek care and support. For those of you who will be caring for my generation of veterans, you need to open yourself to listen to our stories. They have been our burden, and as we approach our later years, they become even heavier, and we need to lay them down before we die. We need to lay them down before we die. Our job as civilians is to help them lay their burdens down, to be safe havens, to be keepers of their stories, including their ugly stories that no one else really wants to hear about. We always like the cleaned up, sanitized versions. So, I want you just to kind of pay attention to this painting. It had a rather dramatic impact on me. I'm rather embarrassed to tell you that for the first 10 years of my VA career, I harbored a prejudice against people with PTSD from Vietnam. Here's sort of how my thinking went. The war was over a long time ago. Why can't they just get over it? They just need to get on with it. And what's with the long hair and tattoos? What's that all about? Blah, 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 blah. Well, our hospital was doing a call for veterans artwork from throughout the whole state of Florida to do a display. And on the day of the display, in a room really about this size, filled with hundreds of paintings from veterans, I'm going through lickety-split until I get in front of this painting. And this painting stopped me in my tracks because suddenly I saw what that soldier saw. More importantly, I saw how he reacted to what he saw because I saw the tears of blood, you see, the loss of vitality. And that's when my eyes were opened. More importantly, that's when my heart was opened. And I tell you this story because people with PTSD do not trust easily. You can say all the right things on the outside, just like I did for those first 10 years, and they will not open up to you because they can sniff out a phony like a hound dog. So when we talk about interventions with combat veterans, the work has to start at home first, right? We have to confront our own prejudice. And we all have prejudices, do we not? If we think we have no prejudices, that's the real problem, isn't it, right? Because we all have this human mind, and it acts as a filter, and it's about bringing that filter out of the dark into the light so we can see how it is affecting our relationships. So it first starts at home. Here's a picture of Tommy Bills, the artist. Some of you read about him in my book, and there you get to see a picture of him. You can see it was a while ago. I was a bit younger then. This is a picture of the Women's Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. I don't know if you're familiar with the woman who spearheaded getting that, and it was her name's Diane Carlson Evans. And a couple years ago, I was in Montana, where she lives, and she was in the audience as I did my Wounded Warriors presentation. And of course, I had her come up to the podium. I actually had her read some of her poems out of this book, which I'll read again in a little while. But one of the things she commented on was what this painting meant to her when I showed it. And this is what she said. She said, "This is exactly what it's like to be living with PTSD from Vietnam. One eye always looking out, seeing everything you all see, and one eye always looking out, seeing Vietnam." So I'm going to skip that part. So what can we do to abide with Vietnam vets? Well, one of the first the lessons that I learned from a Vietnam vet was this. One day I was at the nurse's station and I heard my nurses complaining about a patient who was on his call light all the time because he wanted the nurses to get him outside to smoke, and they couldn't get him outside to smoke as much as he wanted to. Well, I overheard this and I said, "Well, you know, it's okay. I go outside to smoke for lunch every day and I can at least get him off your backs for, that little bit." So that day, I go to get him, and as I said, he had COP, he had emphysema. And so he's on oxygen, and so, I hook him up to his portable oxygen, and, we go outside, and I get to a picnic table where I eat my lunch, and I sit down, and I turn off his oxygen and give him his cigarettes, that type of thing. And occasionally I try to engage him in conversation, and he really didn't want any of it. He just wanted to smoke, and that was fine. Now lunch is done, and I'm getting ready to push him back in, and that's when he engaged me for the first time. And this is what he said. He said, "I want to know what a woman like you is doing eating lunch with a grumpy old man like me." And I looked at him and I said, "Well, I don't know. I sort of like grumpy old men like you." And by now I'm pushing him on the sidewalk up into the back of the hospital. And so I put my hand on the back of his neck and I started massaging his neck. And he goes, "Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you." And I wasn't really sure what he was thanking me for, if it was for that or getting him out to smoke or what. So I asked him, I said, "Well, what is it that you're thanking me for?" And he said, "I'm thanking you for loving a grumpy old man like me." I was speechless. I couldn't say the truth. I couldn't say, "Oh, I wasn't loving you. I was just getting you off my nurses' backs for a little while." That was sort of the truth. But I thought long and hard about what that man said to me. And I think the first clue was when he said, "What is a woman like you?" Because in a hospital, who has the power? Women like me. Women like you. Men like you have the power. And I think what he was saying was just that simple fact of sitting down together at eye level. He felt empowered. I think the second clue was when he called himself a grumpy old man. And of course my inclination when he calls himself a grumpy old man is to say, what? "Oh, no, you're not a grumpy old man, da-da-da-da-da," right? No, it was opening. Yeah, he was grumpy. And there's times, where does that come from? Well, I'm grumpy too. And if I can open up to my own grumpiness and own that and kind of, experience that, then that allows that connection. That allows me to authentically say, well, I sort of like grumpy old men like you, because sometimes I'm kind of grumpy too. And then the third clue, I think, came when I touched him. Because if it's one thing I know, it's that old people, dying people, grumpy people, do not get their fair share of touch. And it takes no extra time to talk to someone like this or touching them wherever you want to, whatever is appropriate. So anyway, so I think that's the first step. As I said, we have to create that safe emotional space because people with post-traumatic stress do not trust easily. So we have to be able to do things that can help them feel like we are trustworthy. One thing is to sit down. When I'm talking to people, I can go up to you. Is there any doubt who has the power right now? No doubt, right? But and I can talk to you just like I am now, and I can be right down here. And does this feel differently? Yeah. Do you feel empowered and more comfortable, he says. It takes no extra time just to be able to build that safe space. Talk frankly without sugarcoating or half-truths. Here's what I would say. I'm hospice, and I train lots of community hospices in how to do this work. And sometimes even hospice people kind of sugarcoat, the D word, right? The dying word, that hospice is about dying. Now, here's what I want to tell you. With veterans with PTSD, they don't trust easily, and they certainly don't trust you if you tell them half-truths, like hospice is not about dying, it's about living. Now, I know exactly. I live that too. I absolutely know what it's meant when you say hospice is not about dying, it's about living until you die. But when you say something like that to a vet, or to anybody with PTSD where they don't trust easily, and they see right through that, everybody knows that hospice is about dying. That's part of the criteria to enter into hospice, right? So don't sugarcoat it. Don't try to make it anything other. They open the door and they say, oh, you're the hospice lady, you're the death angel or something. And, I usually, well, there is that aspect of it. Let's talk about it. You take it in, you bring it in. Reflective language. Sometimes veterans can have pretty crusty language, right? Pretty colorful language, right? And I can tell you that, honestly, I don't cuss at all. And the reason I don't is because, it's kind of a violent, cussing is kind of violent, and I don't want to be putting that, I'm about peace, hopefully, and it's not about putting violent energy out there. So you have a veteran, and I may be coming to see them about hospice care for them, and they're telling me about how awful stuff is, and I'm asking them about that, and I know, well, it's just all this shit, and that's what they'll say, something like that. And when they say something like that, I'll say, well, tell me, what's the worst shit you've had to go through over the past few weeks? Now, here's my point in saying this. If shit is the metaphor that they're using for their experience that they are going through, then that's what I'm going to go with. That doesn't violate my personal code. It's not it's not about me. It's about them. I am going to speak their language while I am with them. That doesn't mean I'm going to leave the room and then do it to try to impress them or, whatever. No. It's just simply being able to join them without judgment. They are no worse because they do cuss and I don't, and I am no better because I don't cuss and they do. It's just, no. Careful touch. Why I say careful touch is this. People with PTSD, you don't want to touch them unless they see you coming or you call out their name first. Otherwise, you're going to get that really exaggerated startle response. But it doesn't mean you don't touch them. You do it with sensitivity. So if you're going to, if you have post-traumatic stress and I'm in here and I'm going to touch you in a very, very subtle way, make it this is not welcome, in a very subtle way. Okay? All he did was kind of recede in his eyes just a little bit. What do? I come back. Okay? What I've just told him is, I heard you, I got it, and I respect it. Okay? So don't leave these people abandoned by, maybe they're difficult patients and say, well, he's got PTSD, stay away from him. No, not necessarily. It means you have to approach more carefully, but they need just as much touch as anybody else. Listen with an open heart. Some of the ugly stuff they may want to talk about is not easy to hear. That means we have to be able to go in and touch our own pain, have done our own healing work. Too often, when we have something hurtful that's happened to us, something ugly that has happened to us, there's a part of ourself that is carrying that pain. And typically what we tend to do is we say, oh, get away, go away, don't bother me. And let's just put on the smile and keep marching and pretend like it's not going on. And so this pain that's over here is just left unmourned. In this. So we have to do our own work of not only re-owning that grief, but also rehoming it, developing an intimate relationship in our own self with that part of ourself carrying the pain. Bring that part of ourself back home, develop that nurturing relationship. That's what I call personal intimacy. We talk about intimacy often, and we use that word like if we're to think of someone outside of ourselves. But what about within our own self? Because if we don't have a personal, intimate relationship with the part of ourself holding our pain, we are going to be running around and I'm going to be going, Kelly, will you please take my pain away? Oh, will you please take my pain away? Oh, will the alcohol, will the TV, I use TV a lot of times to numb out my pain. So we have to do our own interior work of being able to grow that and touch our own part of that self, carrying our own pain. Vicariously allow ourselves to experience whatever that veteran is experiencing. I don't know about you, but when I went to nursing school, when I went to mental health nursing school for my master's, you were basically taught to keep a blank face, right? Empty slate, right? Like that. And you know what I'm talking about is not that at all. If I'm going to join them, if I'm going to abide with them, and I'm going to connect with them in a nonverbal way, whatever they're saying better be written on my face. So when they're happy, I'm happy, and when they're trying to figure something out and they're sorting things through, I'm sorting things through with them, and when they're crying, oftentimes I'm crying, or at least my face is sad. I remember one time we were doing a whole team meeting with a patient, and a nurse came in late, about 10 minutes late, and she said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, can you catch me up on what happened?" And I had not said a word for this whole 10 minutes, and hadn't said a word, this group of professionals around him, and he turned and he pointed to me and he said, "Ask her." She hadn't said a word, but it's written, but everything I have said is written all over her face. See, that's connection. So, validate the part of the person who has these feelings. Veterans have been steeped in a stoic culture that has taught them not to have any feelings, other than maybe anger. Angry feelings are validated. No other feeling. Sadness, guilt, any of that is not validated. So when they are able to touch that, when they're able to cry, when they're able to speak about their guilt or whatever it might be that they wouldn't normally do, validate how much courage it takes to do that. Because I'm telling you, when you are steeped in a culture that tells you absolutely don't do that, it takes a lot of courage to go against that and to truly be able to express that and be with that and show that. I come from Tampa, and you may or may not know that MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa is, for the nation, the center for SOCOM, the Special Operations Command. So last year, I was asked to speak at the SOCOM convention about soul injury. And then at lunchtime, we all go outside around Tampa Bay. I mean, there's thousands of people, because it wasn't just people from the convention, but, they had advertised it. So, there were thousands of people around Tampa Bay. And what you're seeing up there is actually they did a reenactment of a rescue with all the special operation forces from all the services. And so you see, there were Navy SEALs coming in from under the water to do this rescue. There was a helicopter, dropping people in and all this, quite dramatic. And I'm standing there watching this with my camera, taking this picture and lots of others. And all of a sudden it dawned on me who I was standing next to. Because the president of our board, the president of Opus Peace, is a Vietnam veteran. And she was standing right next to me. And I thought, oh my gosh, I wonder how Marie is experiencing this as all these helicopters. And I looked over, and here's what she was experiencing. This was the look on her face. It was a look of terror. And she was essentially saying, get me out of here, I can't do this. Because in her mind, all she could hear was incoming from her Vietnam days. And so my inclination was to do what? Get her out of there, right? Luckily, I knew to do differently. After my initial instinct was to start looking for the exits too. But instead, what I did was this. I reached over and I put my hand on her heart. And I said, breathe. Just breathe. And I took a couple of deep breaths. Just breathe, Marie. Just breathe. And so she did. And what she really transformed from was, I can't do this, to look at her now. Look at how much more relaxed. And these are live camera shots taken by the man standing beside us. And now she has her hand over on her own heart. So what she's doing in that moment is connecting with the part of herself that was holding those painful memories for 40, 50 years. Why is that important? Well, it's important because you may have heard the saying, neurons that fire together, wire together. So what we were doing in that moment was to do some rewiring. Does that make sense? Now, I want to say also, however, I don't want you to think that, if she still would have been really scared, get me out of here in spite of doing that, we would have left, and I would have been the one leading the way. So I don't want you to think that, okay, no, you're going to stay right here. And, this is not the same as desensitization training or any of that type of thing. So I want us just to kind of, for those of you sitting next to someone, if you know the person, just reach over, and maybe I won't have you put your hand on their heart because you may or may not know that person all that well. But in the military, they have a saying, and it's, I've got your back. I've got your back. So I want you to reach over to the person sitting next to you, one of you, and put your hand firmly on that person's back. Just put it firmly. Firmly, right in the middle of their back, right here. Not a hug, right here. And just firmly. And the person who's feeling it, I want you to feel that. Do you feel strengthened just by that person kind of going, yeah, you see, I've got your back. I'm with you. I'm with you. Now in hospice, we like to do a lot of patting. Pat, 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 oh, pat, pat, oh, hug and pat, 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 pat. Don't do that. Don't do the patting part. The hugging part's great, but don't do that pat. It's kind of dismissive. It's, they're there. Nice doggy, nice doggy. No, you want to say, I'm with you. I am here. I can hold your pain with you. And there's strength in that. If you will be firm with that and let them know that, convey that to them. So, all right. How many of you are familiar with any of the works by Henry Nouwen? Any of you? Some? Several? I should know. I'm in a church. I should know. Some of you would know him. Well, he wrote something one time, and I tell you, it really was confusing to me, and I had to grapple with it for really about a year before I really started understanding it. We're not going to grapple with it that long, but it's worth grappling with for a few minutes. Here's what he wrote. He said, maybe it's precisely the shocking confrontation with my hostile self that gives me words to speak about hospitality. Now, I read that, and I did not have a clue what he was talking about. So I just want to kind of start by asking the question in here, how many in here are hostile? Raise your hand if you're hostile. Good. Okay, 3 of you. Okay. That's a hard one to own, isn't it? Isn't it a hard one to own? Because, we're church going, or we're nurses, or we're chaplain, we're very giving people, right? So we can't be hostile, right? So if I'm having an argument with Kelly, and we're arguing about this, blah, 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 and then I leave the argument, and then I come over here, and I go, do you know what Kelly did? Can you believe what she did? Blah, 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 and you shouldn't like her either, because, right? Now, here's my question. Is this hostile? It is. It is. And if we're honest, most of us participate in some form of this, in some way, somehow, almost every day. You go to a meeting, the boss announces, we're going to have this big policy change, we're not going to do it like this anymore, and what do? You leave the meeting and going, oh, can you believe it? Right? That's hostile. Now, here's my point in telling you this. If we can't even own the hostilities that we all do every single day, how in the world can we be safe havens for people who have committed big hostilities? Right? Because I can tell you, if I have done something really, really wrong, if I'm feeling really, really ashamed about something, whether it's, true or not, if I feel ashamed about it, I want to unload on somebody, you know who I'm going to go to? I'm going to go to you 3 people that raised your hand. That's who I'm going to go to. Right? So it really starts at home. How many in here are cynical? Oh, a lot more can say that. Guess what? If you read about cynicism, it talks about how that's a hostile relationship with the world, right? Okay, so there you go. So, I fly on airplanes all the time, almost every week. I like to sit on the window seat. And so one day I'm sitting at the window seat, and a man and his wife sit down next to me. And the man plops his elbow down on the armrest, and I'm not kidding, his elbow came more than halfway into my seat. And so I'm sitting there, and I just looked at him, and I said, "Excuse me, sir." And he looks back at me, and he smiles. Doesn't move his elbow 1 inch. So now I sit there, and I said, put my hand on the tip of his elbow, and I'm going, "Excuse me, sir." And he looks back at me, and he smiles. So I'm sitting there going, what in the world do I do? Well, let me tell you what I did. Now, it was no longer about comfort and armrests. It had turned into a power struggle. And for the next 10 minutes, I plotted ways I could get back at him. I saw him look up from his reading to stare out my window, and for a time I strongly considered pulling the shade down. His wife sat on the other side of him, and their conversation indicated that they had a lot of money. I considered ways I could use that information. I could chide him for his sense of entitlement when he sits in the coach section with us poor folks, or I could ridicule him for not being rich enough to sit in first class, where he'd have all the elbow room he needed. But then I felt a sneeze coming on. This too could prove useful. I could refrain from covering my mouth. Just the previous week, there had been a story on the news about an airline passenger with TB. Maybe I could tell Mr. Elbow that I had TB. I settled on sneezing with my mouth open, but the satisfaction I began to feel from my revenge suddenly melted as I realized what I was doing. I laughed at what a hypocrite I was. Here I was, running around the country, talking about the effect of our personal wars on national wars, and I'm sitting here plotting World War III against an elbow. So, begins with owning our hostility and being able to kind of keep a comical relationship with it. I actually did this story one time, slide one time at Northwestern University at a large audience, and afterward we broke for lunch, and this woman after lunch came up to me and she said, "You know that slide you had about hostility and asking us to raise our hands?" She said, "I just didn't get what you were trying to say. She said, I just knew I wasn't hostile until we broke for lunch, and I went to the bathroom and the line was, like a block long." And she said, "I don't even want to tell you what I did." She said, "But I really get your point, and I can now say, yes, I am hostile." So that made my day. So, what are clues for unresolved soul injuries? Well, I'm going to say that what perpetuates soul injuries, beyond, we know PTSD so well, really. Everybody does nowadays with our current war and the exposure that we are getting with that. And so we know how PTSD affects the body, we know how it affects the brain, we know how it affects the mind. What we are not talking enough about is how it affects the soul. And what keeps these soul injuries and giving alive and going until their dying day oftentimes if they are not revealed and responded to. And what I am going to say is that it is unmourned grief and unforgiven guilt that keeps these soul injuries alive and well. Soul injuries speak a different language. The soul uses a different language. The soul often uses metaphor or symbols or poetry. Think about how every night we all go home and our conscious mind goes to sleep, doesn't it? And our unconscious mind becomes awake with what? Dreams, symbols, images. We don't dream linearly. Our soul speaks a different language. It speaks in poetry. And I think we even have we have some artists. Do we have artists or music people that do art therapy or music therapy in here? I know I've had some through today. I thought we had somebody here tonight. Oh, well, anyway. All right, so let's use some poetry. I want to start out by, I'm going to use this book, Visions of War, Dreams of Peace. It's a book written by women who served in the Vietnam War. And they suffered PTSD, and they used poetry and the arts to recover. And I just want to use a few of the poems, and I think it really helps us understand Vietnam especially. I went to Vietnam to heal, and I came home silently wounded. I went to Vietnam to heal, and I still awaken from nightmares about those we could not save. I went to Vietnam to heal, and I came home to grieve for those we sent home blind, paralyzed, limbless, mindless. So I go on seeing the wounded when I hear a chopper, washing your screams in my sleep, scrubbing the smell of your burned bodies from my clothes, feeling your pain which never eases, fighting a war that never ends. See. What are some of the things you hear as you listen to that? Do you hear the pain? Do you hear the soul injury? See, this is beyond, you certainly see the PTSD, but I think it's more than that. My dead are not silent. They scream in my dreams. My dead are young soldiers, spent, wasted, discarded. They paid the price for political ploys, strategic follies, tactical errors. The politicians and planners, the orderers and senders, discomfited but unashamed, demand that my dead lie quiet, that my grief be smothered, that my ache be shunned, that my memories denied. But my dead will not be stilled. They will not be shelved, numbered, cataloged, straightened into sanitized rows. Their blood yet drips through my soul. Their moans still echo through my heart. How can I make you hear? That need to be heard, that their soul pain connect with someone somewhere. We can be those people. These stories come out easier for them as they age, and especially as they are nearing death. Some days I can't help but remember when these very young men, without their arms or legs or half their faces, looked to me for hope, encouragement, strength, or peace. When hidden behind my smile of, "It'll be okay," was the burden of the lie that knew that it wouldn't. Anger, the silent, stoic anger, the anger at the death, the anger at the carnage, the anger at the demands that could not be met, the pain that could not be stopped, the wounds that could not be healed, the tears that could not be shed. Become numb to the pain. Become numb to the cries. Become numb to the death. Walk away from the grief. When I finally came home, I came home to a life that no longer was real. Unmourned grief. Become numb to the pain. That part of self that saw all that did all of that, is carrying that pain. Grief is what allows us to come back home to ourselves. Grief is the natural, normal expression of loss and change. And when we can grieve, it allows us to let go of what was and open up to what is. And when we do not grieve, we stay stuck. If our country could have known but one dying man alone in Vietnam, with that look on his face and hopelessness in his eye, if this country could have seen the courage he had and concern for his friends, if this country could have wept in his tears and told him he was good, if only this country would have listened, they would have learned of his experience and his sacrifice and then told him they were proud. If only there would have been a thanks. How much differently would our Vietnam vets have experienced after-war trauma if we as civilians would have been a safe vessel for them to unload their grief, their guilt, their pain, and their shame? I guarantee you the trajectory would have been different. You're going to find that a lot of veterans, or some veterans, do not want to be thanked. And there's what I have learn. For example, it's not unusual, I'd go to thank a veteran and they would say, oh, don't be thanking me. The people that you should be thanking aren't here today. They died on the battlefield. Or, I wasn't on the front lines. I was just the cook behind the lines. They'll say things like that sometimes. Now, for many years in my career, when I would hear that type of thing, I would try to convince them. I'd thank them anyway, and I'd try to convince them that, no, whatever. And then finally I decided to start listening to them. And here's what they taught me. What I've come to realize is that there is a spectrum of sacrifice. So, like they said, the ultimate sacrifice is dying on the battlefield, right? There are people that gave up their lives. That is the ultimate sacrifice. On the other end of the spectrum, for example, I have a good friend, and her husband was a water ski instructor in the Air Force, and he loved it. Now, can you compare these two? Are these two sacrifices the same? They're not the same. They are not equal. There's a famous military saying, and it goes like this. Some gave all, and all gave some. So I use that now when I get that response. And what I will say to someone who's kind of rebuffing that, and I will say, you're right. Some gave all, and all gave some. Tell me about the some that you gave. Okay? And then the story often comes forth. Now let me tell you the significance of that. One time I was in Iowa a couple of years ago at the college there in a large auditorium, did an all-day workshop. And the very first presentation I did was Wounded Warriors. At the end I have all the veterans stand, and then we actually go out in the audience and we pin them. And so now it's the end of the day, I'm out in the back signing books and what have you, and this woman comes up to me. And she says, I want to thank you for what you said about the spectrum of sacrifice. And she said, I'm a veteran. And I looked at her because I knew she had not stood that morning. No women had stood that morning. Plus she didn't have a pin on. I'm looking, no pin. She looks at me, she says, you're right. I didn't stand this morning. She said, until you said what you did, I never considered myself a veteran. She said, I served for 20 years in the Army, but I never served overseas. It was all stateside. And she said, until today, I never considered myself a veteran. She said, but I am willing to accept that pin now. So she was crying, I was crying, and whether someone wants to be thanked or not be thanked, there's a story behind it. So, we do a lot of pinning ceremonies and honoring ceremonies, and as important as that is, and I don't want to minimize that, but there's always, that should not be the end all. That's what begins it. That opens the door. I cannot tell you how many times you do that pinning ceremony, and then you sit down and hear the stories, and a lot of times the wife will be sitting there going, he never told me that. I didn't know that. You'll hear that all the time. So make sure you're not just going in there, just to do your duty and, pin them and thank them. And then, no, you got to hear the story, in my mind. And I think we also have to be careful about having our own agenda where we got to thank, or we always say the same thing. It just becomes a rote, automatic type thing. I don't, just because someone's a veteran doesn't mean I automatically thank them, because then it becomes automatic. Right? So I kind of have to hear a little bit of their story oftentimes before I reach out in that way. Another poem. Do you really want to know how you can help me? Then don't turn your back on me as if I were to blame. You share in this too. I did the dirty work. The least you could do is to listen to me. That's the least we can do. That's not asking for too much, and yet it is asking for a lot. What did you do in the war, Mommy? Hazel eyes shining brightly. I wrote a story about a war, Mommy, where nobody got guns or dead. This one was a good war. Why do you have tears now, Mommy? PTSD does not exist in a vacuum. It affects whole family systems, whole generations of family systems. Sometimes we don't realize how even the children of Vietnam War vets here in this country were treated. Here's what a couple of adult people have told me happened to them when they were children. I hated Peter Jennings on the news. He called my dad a hired killer. Somehow I felt responsible. See, as little kids, not knowing this stuff, and they hear this kind of stuff, and, she took that on. We were stationed in Japan. Demonstrators actually came on base to harass not only the soldiers, but us kids. It was scary. I didn't understand what was happening. It's a very different time back then, and it's hard for us to even, to think about what it was like back then for us. I hated social studies. The other kids knew my dad was in Vietnam, and they blamed me for it. You see? That's kids. So I'm getting ready to show you about a 8 or 10 minute film. We were actually filming Wounded Warriors for our website, a newer version. And the cameraman, when we got done filming, he looked at me and he said, "Oh my gosh, did I ever just learn a lot about my father?" And I said, "Really?" And he said a little bit about how angry his father had been and how strict and what have you. And so I thanked him. I said, "Well, thank you for your sacrifices that you had to endure at the hands of your father." And he said, "Well, I don't know about sacrifices. What I know is I survived the military." And I said, "Wow." I said, "Would you mind if we just kept the camera rolling and you talk a little bit about that, because it really tells a story about what families go through?" Well, he really didn't want to do that, but the next day he called me and said he was willing to do it, and I said, "We'll do it anonymously. So we changed his name, and you're only going to see it shot from the back." But here's what he had to say. David, one of the things, as you told us a little bit, kind of briefly about your father, and we thanked you for the sacrifices that you had made because of what he had been through. You said, "Well, I don't know about sacrifices. What I know is I survived the military."
Very true.
So tell me a little bit about what that was like for you.
I have to say, I have to give you a little detail about my dad to start with. He joined the military at age 17, so he was in before he was supposed to, but he wanted to do his part. And as a part of enlisting, he also got married. So he started as PFC, and at the end of his career, he ended up retiring as lieutenant colonel, and he was a pilot. So he did a lot of things, but it was just a big challenge because the house was run very strictly, but it wasn't the family life that other people that I knew, families I knew that were off base and not connected to the military, they didn't have the same thing. Everything at our place was always very strict, which today still has its value. But there was this other side where it always seems like he was trying to escape, and my mom was trying to escape, and they spent a lot of time with alcohol. And then in the end, and that is actually what took his life.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. So what branch of service was he in?
Always a Marine.
To his dying day.
To his dying day.
He was a Marine. And he ran his family as if they were the Marine Corps.
Pretty much.
Like.
Yeah. Pretty much.
And did he serve in combat zones? Or?
He served in Korea, but I'm not sure if he was directly involved in specific combat. But in Vietnam, he was a pilot.
Wow.
He was dropping things that he didn't like to do.
How do you know that he didn't like doing that? Did he talk about that?
He didn't want to talk about it, but that was his job. And back then he was flying a Phantom, and they did not have guns, so they really weren't good for dogfighting. They delivered packages. And he went back even for a second tour. But everything he seemed to be involved with in the military pretty much kept him. Everything was focused around military and military life. Those were the big events, the big things. I mean, we still had the birthday parties and the activities, but occasionally we'd have the little family things and we'd go on an outing, but it was always a challenge, and it took him out of what he was most comfortable with.
His comfort zone was that military.
That structure, you must do it this way, and we get it done.
You said the other day that what struck you as you look back on his life is that he was always angry.
Very much so. He could never turn it off, because the only thing that seemed to get rid of his anger was the alcohol. And that was true with him and all of his other Marine Corps buddies. That's everything.
So he kind of stayed ramped up all the time.
All the time. And even when they took it down a notch by getting drunk, that's when they got, I can't think of a better word, feisty, belligerent, nasty.
So maybe he was kind of self-medicating to try to calm down a little bit, and yet, ironically,
it didn't.
It made him kind of nasty, it sounds like.
It let the evil out that he was controlling.
Now, you mentioned earlier that he had been married 8 times.
8. Mm-hmm. Yep. He wanted the companionship, but it just didn't fit in with what he had to have somebody there. Almost per se a caregiver. But there was always something going on that
I'm guessing he may have been in attack mode with his wives as well in some ways, possibly.
It could be, but then again, alcohol was always a part of it. And he'd say stupid stuff, do stupid stuff. Not that he ever got in problems with the law or something like that, but it was just,
So with all of this going on in his life, how did this impact you as a young boy?
Like I mentioned earlier, there were other kids that I knew, and I envied the lifestyle that they lived, the home life. I mean, we had the Thanksgiving meals, but it was like you did the meal and it was over. Now you're back to regimentation, even though it wasn't, but there were basic rules you had to follow. Not to say that we didn't get away with stuff, because I think all kids can find a way to do that. But there was never a fluidness, a family functionality that you could find with another family that wasn't in the military.
So you saw softness maybe in other households that was kind of lacking.
Unity.
Unity.
I would think would be a better word.
Okay.
Everybody, they were together because they wanted to be together. They enjoyed being together. But on our side of it, I felt like we were commanded, directed, ordered.
Controlled.
We're going to do this.
Control,
And that's the way it went.
Yeah. We see that so often with combat veterans, again, because they are often so helpless in combat with stuff that happens to them. They try to control everything and their families and everybody else that they love, trying to control and protect. And the irony is oftentimes is it sometimes boomerangs.
Yeah, because the other thing that I just happened to think about, and I think I maybe knew it before, but every time my dad was on a tour of duty and he was out of the country, when he came back, I got a sibling.
All right, so...
I mean, I don't know if anybody's done a study on that, but every time he was back in the country,
Okay.
I got a sister, and then another sister, and then a brother.
All right. So that also, when you talk about unit, that was kind of a very fractured family then.
Very much so.
And there, and the threat of that, and what that does to family life. Wow. Well, I can see why you said the other day, I survived the military. I showed this pen earlier when we were filming. It's a little angel pen, and the dress is an American flag. And we made these little cards that says, because we know that you have also paid a price for America's freedom, we honor you with this pen. It's our way of acknowledging the many ways that you have been impacted by the military and the many ways that you have provided care and support to our veteran. So my hope is that each time you look at this, may you appreciate what you have done for our country by surviving the anger that your dad had, the overly rigid structure that you had to endure.
in addition to the respect and discipline that have allowed you to be a good father and a productive human being.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
So I don't want to say that this is typical, and yet I can't tell you how common I've heard these kinds of stories, pieces of these kinds of stories. So this is on our website if you want to use it. It's a great teaching tool for bringing up, the issues of family and how often they are unsung heroes. Also, the other tool we have, Dignity Funeral Homes has made a couple of pamphlets available for free for everybody. I wrote one directly for veterans, and my business partner wrote for the caregivers. But I just want to read you one thing out of this one for families, because there is a common saying among Vietnam vets, and it goes like this. Most Vietnam vets with PTSD have been married 3 times. Okay, that's what the Vietnam vets themselves say. So here's what Pat writes about in this. She says to the wives often, "You may recognize yourself and your children as one of the 3 different families at a Vietnam vet's deathbed. Perhaps you are the first family, abandoned when the veteran first returned home from war and was unable to reconnect with you. You and your children may be angry. Or maybe when the veteran remarried and started a second family, it was with you. You and your children may have lived with abuse, drugs, and alcohol and developed dysfunctional coping mechanisms. After a second divorce, the veteran may have gotten into recovery and gotten help for his PTSD. A third marriage is often to someone who already has children. If this is you, your children may reap the benefit of the veteran's recovery and think that their stepfather is very special. Imagine this veteran's deathbed with all 3 of these family members present. Right? Can't tell you how many times that scenario is true that we have dealt with at our VA. So, these are beads. These are colors of service in Southeast Asia. These are beads that can only be made by Vietnam veterans, and it can only be given by one Vietnam vet to another. As I told you, our charge nurse, Marie, is a Vietnam veteran, as is her husband. They're the ones that make all the beads for our program. And, when you see her take these beads off and reach down into that hospice bed to that Vietnam vet, and she pins them and welcomes them home, I want to tell you, you will see magic happen right before your eyes. And sadly, too often what you will hear from that Vietnam vet is, "You are the first person who has ever welcomed me home." So, we need to be aware that Asian ancestry in the healthcare provider might be a trigger for Vietnam vets, and we can't take this personally. I used to work with a Japanese surgeon, and I was going to him to ask him, I was actually going to one of his patients to have him sign a consent for the lung he was going to have removed from the next day by the surgeon. And here's what the patient said to me. He said, "I've checked out my surgeon. I know he's a top-notch surgeon. I know this is irrational, but you just need to know that I served in the Pacific in World War II, and I just can't stand the idea that tomorrow I'll be asleep and a Japanese man will be standing over my heart holding a knife." And I heard the fear in his voice, and so I called the surgeon. I was very careful how I reported it to him because I didn't want him to think this man was being racist. That's not where he was coming from, but I need not have worried because this very gracious surgeon said, "Oh, it's okay. I understand. I'll transfer his case to Dr. Bartlett. Tell him not to worry." So that's what I'm talking about when some of these triggers, we just have to be sensitive to that. If a Vietnam vet speaks about how Americans treated them, apologize. If they talk about having never been welcomed home, it's not too late to welcome them home. I cannot tell you how many times, as I said, especially with our Vietnam vets who were so mistreated when they got home, before I leave their room, I will reach out to shake their hand, or I will kneel down in front of them, and I will say something to the effect of, "I am so sorry for the scorn and indignities that you had to suffer because of our ignorance. Please know that you are a hero, and that unsung heroes are the most worthy kind." And I guarantee you that every time you will see tears. More importantly, you will see a soldier brought home from war at last. So, very quickly, I just want to say that forgiveness is at the core of healing for our combat veterans. If you think about it, they have a lot to forgive. They have to forgive themselves for having killed other people. They have to forgive themselves for not killing. I've had more than a few that have said something to the effect of, oh, they had to pull me off the front lines. I couldn't do it. And so, they feel guilty about that. They have to forgive themselves for not dying. Survivor's guilt is very common. If they committed friendly fire, in other words, killed one of their own, that's a different layer of guilt yet. They have to forgive the enemy. They have to forgive the government for using and betraying them if they're a Vietnam vet. They have to forgive the world for being like it is with war in it. They have to forgive God for allowing the world to be like it is with war in it. And if they are unable to do this before they come to the end of their lives, then they arrive at the end of their lives filled with bitterness. And I can tell you that bitterness is a venom for the soul that greatly complicates peaceful dying. If you take nothing else away from this lecture, what I would want you to take away tonight is when someone's trying to tell you how ashamed they feel about something that they did or did not do, don't dismiss it with well-intentioned platitudes like, that was a long time ago, you don't need to be worrying about that now, or you were just following orders, being a good soldier, doing your duty, those types of things. Because what you're really saying to them is, don't tell me about your guilt and shame. I don't want to hear it. Stuff it behind that stoic wall yet again, because what they are asking for is forgiveness. So I'm going to have to skip some of these things because they're running out of time. I'm going to skip that. Let's just close with a couple poems and a slideshow. We went to the war and we came back to chaos. We went with the values of healing and caring, and we came back with the hatred of a nation. We went believing in a just cause. We came back suspicious of our great leaders. We went thinking our young bodies immortal. We came back knowing we were used and fragile. We went innocent and forgiving. We came back embittered and intolerant. We went alone and open. We came back alone and isolated. We went whole and unwise. We came back fragmented and wise. We went to the wall and we came away with hope. Anybody surprised by that last line? Yes. Okay, let's go one more. I am as much with the dead as with the living. Facing the wall, I encounter something I left behind so many years ago. I'm lifted away and reunited with those who suffered and died and left me alone. Left me alone with the memories of them, left me too numb to cry. As I put my hands on the hard granite and touched the names of those who died, I no longer felt alone. Those who had died came back and allowed me to grieve, embraced me, and touched a part of my soul I had thought was gone. That vague place, Vietnam, which could not bring forth emotion or feelings or tears. It was such a relief to cry now, to feel again, so strange. I felt unbearable sadness and yet set free, free of an intangible burden. You see, when you carry unmourned grief and it creates that soul injury, what happens when we can grieve it? That's where it comes. I'll skip that. This is a picture that was at the Vietnam Wall Memorial. It was taken off the dead body of a North Vietnamese soldier by the American soldier who had killed him. There was a note attached to the photograph when it was left at the Vietnam Wall, and here's what the note read. Dear Sir, for 22 years, I've carried your picture in my wallet. I was only 18 that day we faced one another. Why you didn't take my life, I'll never know. You stared at me so long, armed with your AK-47, and yet you did not fire. Forgive me for taking your life. So many times over the years, I've stared at your picture and your daughter. Each time, my heart and guts would burn with the pain of guilt. Forgive me, sir. I share this story with you for 3 reasons. First of all, if this man had not been ever able to achieve this level of forgiveness when he did, and instead he came to your healthcare facility where you're taking care of him, what do you think would be on his mind and heart that hopefully you will know how to respond to, and you won't dismiss it with well-intentioned platitudes? I guarantee you it would be this. It also shows the value of war memorials because they often act as catalysts to bring this stuff out of the dark into the light, so in fact there can be healing. And lastly, I believe that there is a gaping wound in our society of unmourned grief and unforgiven guilt that we are not yet responding to. It is why we started our nonprofit Opus Peace, because I believe there is a lot more that we can be doing when we start attending to the soul injuries. So, this is my favorite one. Now I feel at peace with myself. All the anger has left. It was the sediment at the bottom of the bottle that I couldn't reach, but I finally got it out. You see, she had been coping with the pain in her soul by trying to numb it out, right? But at some point, she decided to stop numbing it and go for the sediment that was causing her to drink in the first place. You see, to do that work. So, okay. First of all, I just want to ask if there's anyone here, and I'm assuming that there's probably several of you that did serve in Vietnam, in countries. So I just want to ask any of you who served in the Vietnam War to please stand. Yes. We are most humbled. So, I'm going to close with a slideshow, and then we'll take questions. Let you just start by reading that. What you're going to see up on the screen in a minute is going to be things that I've heard from veterans that I have cared for.
I release and
So, questions, comments, concerns about anything I've said
We
tonight?
realize it's running a little late, so we'll just do like 2 or 3 questions, and then we will convene out in the lobby for coffee. If you have questions?
Yes, sir.
You talked about the power of rituals.
Mm-hmm.
If I remember correctly, did you say there was 3 phases or 3 parts of a ritual?
Yeah, a well-planned ritual does indeed have 3 stages, and that's kind of a whole nother topic to talk about. But the reason rituals are so powerful is because they access the unconscious, you see, so you can heal from the inside out. It's not just about trying to manage symptoms and keep things in. But if you, in my book, actually in both books, I have a whole appendix in there about rituals and how to design them well in the 3 stages so that they are effective. The most common reason why rituals are not effective is people like to skip the first stage, which is really opening up to what the actual problem is and acknowledging it and owning that piece. And we as Americans, we like to skip to the happy ending part, so we just gotta skip to that piece. But anyway, I do have it well described in either book. Both books have it, so you'll really get it there. Yeah. You 3 Vietnam vets, what do you have to say? Take it around, put them on the spot there just a little bit. You can always pass it, you know. I'm just sort of teasing you. I'm not trying to push too much, but I want you to have an opportunity to say something, you 3.
I'm one of the people who gave a little bit. I was on a base, fairly secure. The worst thing that happened there was rocket attacks once in a while, but most of the time, if you heard the siren, why, the rocket attack was already over. So I really don't have any trouble with PTSD or anything. But I really enjoyed your talk. I appreciate everything you've said. I deeply sympathize with the people. I never experienced any of that hostility that other people did. My parents threw me a party when I came home,
yes.
so I was very lucky in that respect. But
Glad to see you.
But I do have a little bit of anger about how so many people lost their lives for a war we really weren't allowed to win. I do kind of resent that a little bit, but otherwise, everything is wonderful. I can't complain.
Mm-hmm. Right behind him. Vietnam vet right there. No. And there was somebody back here. Did he leave already? Vietnam vet back here? No. Okay. It's all right. Well, you do. I thank you for what you said, too, because sometimes we don't want to assume that everybody, just because they went to war, have PTSD. You know, the statistics are about 1/3 came back with PTSD. So you bring up a good point. We should not make the assumption. Just because someone was a combat veteran does not mean they have PTSD. We have to assess for that. We shouldn't assume that. The other thing, you bring up something else that I think's important about, you know, that you weren't allowed to win the war. You know, when you see, there's nothing sadder to me is to have a Vietnam War vet at the end of his life, and occasionally I've had this happen where they look at me and they'll say, all that we sacrificed, all that we suffered for nothing. You see, that's very, say it, you have a World War II vet, you'll have a World War II vet, they'll see a picture of Hitler, you know, on TV, they'll swell up with pride and they'll go, you know, we helped to stamp out evil from this world. You see, Vietnam vet, instead of being able to feel pride, feel angry. See, that's very different. Can you see how that's a very different end-of-life experience for them? Those are some of the complications and the things that we need to understand and be sensitive about, not judgmental about. Other things.
I grew up in California. This is not a question, it's a comment, and it's an appreciation. I protested the war. I was angry about the war. And for many years, probably about 3 decades, when I met a woman and became very intimately close to her who was a medic during the war, I have been grateful that I've lived long enough to see a bigger picture and have an opportunity to say thank you. It was not your fault. I'm still angry at the government, but not at those of you who served.
Yeah. Kind of reminds me a good closing, I think. One time I went to Sarasota, which is right across the bay from Tampa, and so I took some of my colleagues with me, and I was doing Wounded Warriors, going to go out and pin the veterans. I took about 40 pins with me to do this. In the audience was about 50 veterans, and so I didn't have enough pins. So I just want to tell you what happened that day. After all the veterans sat down, one veteran raised his hand. He was red in the face, and his speech was both halting and urgent. He said, "I'm so pissed off right now, I don't even know if I can speak. I am a Vietnam veteran, and I did not get a pin. Once again, I am pushed to the side. This is exactly what happened when I came back home 40 years ago." His next words were heartbreaking. Tearfully, he asked, "When is it going to end?" Initially, I was speechless. My heart sank as I felt this man's betrayal. The very thing I had hoped to accomplish had produced just the opposite effect. I said, "I'm so sorry, sir. I don't know what I can say to make it up to you. The last thing I would want to do is to push you aside." Sarcastically, he said, "Well, it's a little too late for that." A veteran from the other side of the room came over to him. She took her pin off that she had just received and pinned it on him, saying, "I want you to have this. You deserve it more than I do." The room erupted into applause, but it didn't stop there. Cheryl, one of my colleagues, came over to him, saying, "I was one of those people who pushed you aside 40 years ago. I was a Vietnam War protester in the 60s. He looked at her guardedly before she went on. "My brother was in Vietnam, and I was doing what I could to bring him home." He responded, "You don't know how much that hurt us." And Cheryl tenderly responded, saying, "You're right, I didn't, but I do now, and I'm sorry I hurt you." Tears and hugs sealed their reconciliation, while the room burst into applause yet again. Meanwhile, I told the audience, this is how we heal our nation, one soldier at a time, one gratitude at a time, one apology at a time.
Thank you, Deborah.
You're welcome.
We're so graced to have you with us today. We're going to give Deborah a few minutes to get over to the book table. We do have books that you can have signed, both of her books, The Hero Within and The Peace at Last.
And 100% of the proceeds go to fund our nonprofit, and it's a 501c3, so it's tax deductible for you. So hopefully you'll consider buying a couple books.
Yes. Yes, she's got a big, heavy suitcase. She wants it to be lighter. Really, thank you so much, Deborah. I was struck by your comment and the comments at the end by Deborah about the relationship, that sometimes it's just more important to be in relationship than to be right. And that's, I think, what we're trying to do with the Dwell With Me series, is to be in relationship rather than be right. So I really thank you for dwelling with us today. I would ask you, there's evaluation cards that might help us be more right sometimes with our choices of topics and things like that. So we would really appreciate your evaluation of tonight. And on the other side of the card is a spot if we don't have your email currently, so that we can let you know of future events. And I call your attention to, in the program, are several future events. Next Thursday in particular, we have Theodore Halpern, who is a Holocaust survivor, who will be sharing his story with us. And we have several more events between April and May. So again, thank you so much for being here this evening. Join us there's coffee and cookies in the common ground, which is just to your left as you exit. Thank you again.